Everyone's coming in. Hello, everyone. A lot of people on Zoom. Well, welcome back. Welcome to you on Zoom. I'm Zach Lesser. I'm a professor in the English department. I organized the seminar along with John Pollack, curator in the Kislak Center, and Jerry Singerman.
So without leave.
Yeah. Jerry Singerman, who's humanities editor emeritus from Penn Press, but is not here today. So hopefully we'll show up soon. And Priya Namrath, who is the Brassel Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text and makes sure that everything runs smoothly, and is also the person who sends you the emails and is going to pass around our sign-in sheet. If you add your email to the sign-in sheet, you will get on the email list and you'll get 1 to 2 messages a week, which will tell you what's coming up, and the Zoom link if you want it. If you're on Zoom and you'd like to get on our email list, you can just send a message in the chat to Priya, and she'll ensure that you get on the list.
Look, Jerry's here.
Here's Jerry. If you're on Zoom, please ensure your mute is on, and during Q&A, you can use the raise hand function to let us know you have a question, and we'll call on you, and you can ask your question live, or you can put questions in the chat, and Priya will ask them for you. So it's been a great semester of talk so far. We're heading into the final quarter. Go Birds. Next week, sorry, it's tonight. The game's tonight. Next week, we have Marco Aresu, who will speak to us about Scribe 106, which sounds like a new sci-fi movie from Bong Joon-ho, but it, in fact, is the name of a Florentine scribe who we'll learn about. So hope you'll come back next week for that. And tonight, we're very pleased to welcome Penn's own Kate Meng Brassel. Kate received her PhD in classics from Columbia in 2018, following an MPhil from Cambridge and an MA from Princeton. I don't know what happened. You couldn't go to Oxford for
missed one.
Yeah. And before joining Penn, Kate has, she taught in Columbia's core curriculum, and she also worked as a production assistant at CNN. And that maybe that helps her in the courses she teaches on classical reception on TV and film. In 2023-24, she spent the year at the American Academy in Rome as the Andrew Heiskell Rome Prize winner. There, she developed a project on the book and the body in the satires of Persius, which includes historicizing his work in the period under Nero, but also through a longer history through the early printing of classical literature. And this topic also forms the subject of her forthcoming first monograph, and I got an update on the title 10 minutes ago, Persius's book, Reading Roman Satires. And she writes that the book proposes an iambic model for understanding the Neronian poet's relationship to both poetry and philosophy. And since iambic is a very important word for me as a Shakespearean, but I don't understand it in this context, I'm excited to ask her later what this iambic model may be. The book will also include her original translations of the poems into English. Here at Penn, Kate teaches a wide range of courses that I'd like to take. They include Papyrus to Pixels, the history of the book from the ancient world to today, Race and Ethnicity in the Ancient World, Writing Women at Rome, and other courses in Latin and Greek literature. She's also on the executive board of GSWS, though that term does not begin until next year, so they can't ask her to do any work just because I said that. And she's beginning a new project on Seneca's Troades called On Violence Against Trojan Women. She also works on the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. Kate joined Penn during the pandemic, teaching online. We have a colleague of mine in English who also joined at that moment, and I know it was like an incredibly difficult thing to do. So I'm very impressed by people who did that. That year, she was interviewed by a classics major, and I found this interview and enjoyed it. And the classics major asked, as a student, was there a moment in your life when you suddenly realized that you wanted to study classics seriously? I don't know if you remember this question. And you told the story of your sophomore year of college at Columbia, when you were deciding whether to become an English major or a classics major. You said it was the last day before I had to declare my major, and I was sitting there in torture staring at the major declaration form. And this graduate student walked by and said, "What's wrong? You look horrible." And I said, "I don't know what to major in." And he said, "Just major in classics." And so I really like this story for two reasons. First of all, as chair of English, I realized we need to change our whole approach to recruiting new graduates. And we just send our graduate students out to find distressed looking graduates and tell them just major in English. That could be our new motto on our website, just major in English.
Yes.
But second of all, she continued by saying more seriously, I had some questions, even from my first Latin class in freshman year on satire, that I didn't feel I'd answered. And so I didn't want to stop until I found the answers. And she's still working on those questions in her book on the satires of Perseus. And that is like why I'm in this business, that kind of feeling. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more tonight as she presents to us on binding and the discipline, some paths around the classics. Please welcome Kate.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you to the organizers for having me. I am someone who has lurked at the back of this room for a few years. I feel extremely intimidated to be sitting here at the front. I'm also coming to you today straddling two projects. I just had my workshop on my first monograph on the Roman satirist Perseus on Friday, and that is a little book about a little book. And we'll talk about its smallness perhaps later as we look at some of the copies. But coming to the final form of my first book was actually profoundly influenced by my sort of meeting with the 15th century manuscript codex on the table, which I'll discuss. It opened up a lot of new questions for me. Some of which I incorporated into the book that I am closing up now, but more of which I'm parlaying forward, hopefully into a second project, which I'm eager to explore with all of you who are much, much more experienced in dealing with this kind of material. Especially since as I have gone down the rabbit hole of research that was mostly inspired by dealing with this codex, I have found that most of my hunches have been wrong, and so that's very exciting for me. But I would definitely looking for feedback. So broadly speaking, I've become curious about how the format of professional books in my discipline, which is sometimes called classics or classical philology or classical studies or sometimes Greek and Roman studies. I'm curious about how the professional format of our standard editions influence interpretation and scholarly outcomes. And this was just sort of a chilling sort of realization I had as I was working with this codex. So I'm going to use my first author, Perseus, the satirist, whom I'll introduce you to a little bit today, just because why not, as a case study, hopefully in this project. And the other case study that I'll sort of broach today is the sort of fate of the pre-epic poems. That for most of their history traveled with Virgil until we stopped thinking of that as appropriate as a nascent discipline. Oh, I didn't share my screen. I'm so sorry. One moment. Okay. There we are. So when I'm thinking about binding, I've been thinking both about which texts are bound together and how the texts that we, as sort of professionals in the discipline, have become accustomed to seeing together, have become that binding or those combinations have become naturalized features of text that we assume to be meaningful, rather than historically peculiar ways of reading, actually, and historically specific ways of reading. First, I'll introduce you briefly to Perseus. If I can get my slides to move, which I cannot. Okay, there we are. Perseus' satires, according to the critics. Unless you've been paying attention to the footnote sections of several histories of the book, you may not have spent much time thinking about Perseus. But he was extremely popular in antiquity, the Middle Ages, and it turns out the early Renaissance. And this is what I'm still trying to figure out. He develops a bad rap, as you can see, as the modern period pushes on. Dryden called him scabrous, hobbling, and hard. I understood it. Dryden says in reference to a passage of Satire 4 that I'll share with you a little later, but for that reason turned it over. humorless, stoic in modern scholarship, and in the words of a very senior Latinist who shall go unnamed, not Latin. The quote from Jerome, which is funny because Jerome, as a translator, is supposed to be good at linguistic puzzles. This quote from Jerome travels often with the scholarship on Perseus, but it turns out probably, as my colleague Nick Jansen has suggested to me, probably is 17th century in origin and probably Northern European in origin and not actually an ancient anecdote. But you can see how you know, the many manuscripts that we have and the tradition of scholia that we have for Perseus attest to his broad popularity, which has like really taken a U-turn very rapidly. Nevertheless, click. I think this is a shame. As scholars of ancient reading and the ancient book have long recognized, there's a lot here. So I'm going to share on this slide with you and on the next slide, two passages of Perseus, most often cited in histories of reading and histories of the Roman book. This scene, just for setup, is from his first long satire, which is really a takedown of the Roman practice of recitatio, sort of oral performances by poets in which they shared, and some people consider published their work when it was ready for sharing. We write confined, this guy with measured beat, that guy footloose, the next big something great for soulful lungs to puff and pant. Of course, you'll read these words before the people from your perch, brushed and all cleaned up, a brand new toga, and at last sardonic's birthstone. Once you've rinsed your throat with liquid pretense, you're shattered by the climax of your darling eye. I also could have translated that by the orgasm of your darling eye. Then no voice serene, no morals here. You'd see those giant Tituses a tremble as your songs get in their pelvises and when their inmost parts are scratched by all that quivering verse. So likening the experience of reading, because listening, sitting in one of these audiences was also a form of ancient reading, to probably anal sex here. And then the other most frequently cited passage is from, in the history of the book, is from Satires 3. And I'll just pause to note that this passage is really often cited, especially the section I've outlined in red in histories of the book, which is great, often without noting that it is one of the most disputed passages in Perseus for people who work, the few people who work on Perseus. Excuse me. But the setup here seems to be a hungover writer, basically, just waking up. Of course, it's this, relentless, brilliant morns already at the windows, and it magnifies the narrow cracks with light. We're snoring loud enough to ventilate falernum's foam. Stiff stuff. The dial's shadow, meanwhile, says it's almost noon. What are you doing? Crazy dog day heat's been cooking crops for hours now, and every sheep's beneath a sheltering elm, says someone from my crew. What, really? Truly? Hurry, come here, someone. No one? Glass-green bile arises, surging up. I split in half. You'd think the herds of Arcady were braying. And now a book and two-toned skin whose hairs are shaven off have reached my hands, as well as papers and a naughty reed. Then we complain. The liquid's hanging clumpy from the pen. But after adding eau de source, the inky squid dissolves. We then complain because the nib is dribbling double drips. You loser, more a loser every day. Is this what we have come to? Why not like a little baby dove or kingly boy demand your dinner mashed to pap puree, then wrathfully refuse the teat of mommy's lullaby? Am I to work with such a pen? Who gets these words? Why chant these ambiguities? The joke's on you, you've come unglued, deplorable, and so on. And so this passage is often invoked because of the the number of book materials that are mentioned in one breath here. We have the liber, or the book, the book roll, probably meant. The membrana, the parchment, that's the two-toned skin. The two-toned because when you shave parchment, one side is like a slightly different tone from the other. And then the writing implements of the reed pen here called both hirundo and calamus, and also the sepia, the ink. But that's not actually why I became interested in looking at historical copies of Perseus, although it became why. The reason why the scene prompted me to really want to look at historical copies, and for a while I was looking at old images of sort of 10th and 11th century manuscripts, is because the reason why this passage is really disputed is because nobody can agree who's talking, how many people are speaking, whether it's one or two or three, and people have all different ways of dividing this up, which we won't go into today. And so Zach mentioned that I started here as a visiting assistant professor during lockdown. And as soon as we opened, I sort of ran screaming away from my computer where I was just, really dissolving into the digital abyss. And I ran into the arms of the Kisleck Center, where it turns out this codex was waiting for me. So there are a couple of things to say about this codex, and well, there are many things to say about this codex, but I'm going to sort of outline the ways in which it's sort of affected my thinking here. This codex is late 15th century. I did not discover that. There is a typewritten sheet from Nico Knauer in there, in with the manuscript file. And he found, after scrupulously reading all of the marginal comments here, a reference to Vala, which helps us date this to the late 15th century. So thank you, Professor Knauer. So I wanted to see this copy because what I'm interested in, or what I was interested in, is how different readers have construed the many speakers of Perseus. And often you find that in manuscripts, manuscript versions with interlinear notes, trying to sort of mark up the page and sort of showing you what the practices of actually interpreting passages looked like historically. The quotation mark was not developed until much later, as you all know. And so the sort of, you had to decide for yourself who was speaking. And that was sort of one of the many challenges that this text presents. So this copy was written with care on parchment, as you can see, produced after 1452. As Knauer notes, but provisionally I'm dating it to the 1480s or 90s based on the printing of Thucydides, Vala's Thucydides, which is referenced here. So Vala gives us a date after which it must have been produced, but that text, his text was not actually in circulation. It was produced, but then locked in some tower and not actually printed until later, a few decades later. And I'll show you some other ways that I've dated it in a moment. But importantly, this copy was produced after the Editio Princeps of Perseus, which was produced in Rome in 1469, which I'll explain in a moment as well. The glosses that you can see here line every single page of this copy. It's really phenomenal. They are roughly similar to the traditional ancient scholia and to other early modern commentaries. The content of the glosses has not been that exciting to me yet. They're roughly similar to marginal notes that you see elsewhere. But what's really interesting is just the sheer quantity of interpretation, which also turns out to be historically significant as well. So I was sitting with great delight with this beautiful parchment copy. Not beautiful in the sense that it's, embellished, but just beautiful in that it just exhibits so much care and thinking here. Here is where my brain really exploded. Is actually at the end of this text. So you reach about halfway through this codex, the end of Persius's satires, and the book continues on paper. And it turns out that this is Ovid's Ibis. Ibis, which is no one's favorite poem from antiquity, which I had deliberately left out of my dissertation. And I think I even have a footnote in the dissertation saying this is a huge, I know I should be thinking about the Ibis, but it's a huge can of worms that I'm not going to open. It is Ovid is obviously more familiar to you all because of the Metamorphoses, the Heroides, etc. The Ibis is a riddling curse poem in elegiac distich from Ovid's period of exile. It's several hundred lines long, in which he rails against an unknown enemy obliquely by discussing all the baddies of classical mythology and archaic history in the most sort of riddling ways. And so actually interpreting the Ibis often means just trying to figure out who he's talking about for every single line, which is why I didn't want to touch it. So the question that this raised for me upon seeing this is this a true sort of miscellany, just a mixture of random pieces of literature, or was this deliberately bound together? The shift from the parchment Perseus, to the paper Ovid might sort of argue in favor of thinking that this is, just two pieces of text. They were sort of short. You want most books to be a bit longer, so why not put these two together? But I sent myself to book school to figure this out for sure, and followed up with Paul Needham, who was very generous on the watermarks on the paper side. And concluded actually that this paper was cut down from a standard sheet to match the pre-existing parchment Perseus. So it's not just a random bringing together of two texts. So this raises the stake of dating the book after the editio princeps of Perseus. If Perseus is available in a printed form in sort of bindings that look largely similar to how we have them today, why make this book? And I mused for a long time that these were the two least loved works of antiquity, doomed forever to be riddling at each other in a sort of special book hell. Indeed, upon sort of closer inspection, it seems to me that the combination of the two texts cannot be a random yoking together of castaways at all. Basically the question is why? And I'm going to let that question linger for a while. It will turn out that, in fact, it is not because these are the two least loved works of antiquity and they're sort of living together in this special hell. But I didn't know that at the time, and I actually found this to be an incredibly generative combination of texts. It made me actually really rethink genre and why we take certain generic definitions to be true or to be real, meaningful, and privilege certain understandings of genre over others. And it also made me ask what sort of the consequences of what I've come to call the normative bindings are. So on this slide, okay, good. You can see on the left the editio princeps at the Morgan, the 1469 editio princeps next to the Penn Codex. They're hair-raisingly similar, actually, in size. they're almost exactly the same size. And I was sort of actually shocked when I went up to the Morgan to see it. This was a hugely generative moment for me. So the difference, they look so similar, and even the clasps, the sort of clasps are similar. So actually the stakes of making the Perseus ibis copy seemed even higher to me. I mentioned before that I left the ibis out of my dissertation. The ibis participates in what we can broadly call iambic literature, which is different from Zach's iambic literature. Neither Perseus nor Ovid is writing in iambics, but they are both drawing upon the tradition of iambic invective poetry from antiquity. So iambic is associated with like quite virulent railing against either a foe, often a personal foe, or a social ill. Seeing this new binding forced me to delete that footnote as I started working on the book, and to play out the consequences of understanding Perseus as, in fact, iambic throughout his book, and not just in the short prefatory poem in which he does write in an iambic meter. And so that is actually sort of an interpretive path that I sort of went down after this encounter with the codex. But my hunch that Perseus and Ovid were sort of put together in this codex because of their sort of obscure, hateful nature turned out to be wrong. But I think the implications of seeing of these sort of non-normative bindings are extremely generative, and it made me sort of question what the consequences of having standard editions sort of replicating each other in the same way are for the discipline. We don't have it here today, but looking at Perseus in different historical formats, including a large German, early 15th century German copy that we have here, made me very self-conscious about the peculiarity of our modern professional reading practices. These are the standard editions here, sort of some of the standard editions and standard translations here. And as you can see, Perseus is always paired in these series because of modern printing norms. Perseus's satires are short by our standards, but according to the sort of customs or practices of the Roman book, Perseus' satires are a perfectly good length for a Roman book. It's only when you get to the modern book that it seems too short to be a book and needs to be paired with something else. And Perseus becomes an addendum rather than a standalone book role. So for example, actually, Clausen's Oxford Classical Text, the sort of big modern standard edition of Perseus from the 1950s, was originally printed alone. But when it was reprinted, and in all the subsequent printings, it's been printed with Juvenal. And as you can see, the pairing with Juvenal is replicated in the Loeb, which is how most people access. Most people are accessing literature and its Latin literature and its translations. I started to wonder about looking around in libraries in sort of subsequent months and years. I started to wonder like how flattening actually and distorting these practices are of formatting all of these texts in the same way and sort of binding them in ways that accommodate them to modern book expectations. I don't have like a better path for it. It's just something that I think maybe I want to be more aware of as I sort of continue my work on Latin literature. Equally importantly, you can see how the scholarship in reading actually sort of replicates then the bindings of standard editions. So if Perseus and Juvenal come together in the OCT, they also then come together in scholarly interpretation. You don't see a Perseus and Ovid companion you see a Perseus and Juvenal companion, just as you see a Perseus and Juvenal Loeb, which just as you see a Perseus and Juvenal OCT, and so on. Sometimes, if you're lucky, he's paired to form a normal length book with Horace in the Penguin Classic series, for example, as a translation. No doubt because Penguin wouldn't be able to sell a Perseus on his own because of the length. It's not a modern book length, not to mention the content, but also just the norms of the book, the length of what makes a book. Whereas Juvenal is very lengthy and very voluminous, and so he gets his own book. And so Perseus becomes really sort of the overlooked middle child, the Jan. So I went to Rome, as Zach mentioned, thinking I was going to rewrite my book on Perseus based on these non-normative bindings. I'm going to show you one example, but first I'm going to preface this by saying this was incredibly naive. Obviously, as you guys all know, but I didn't know at the time, was going to open up a whole different sort of set of historical concerns that really needs to be its own project and can't just sort of be an overlay to a pre-existing reading. And that's actually what I'm hoping you guys will be able to weigh in on today, especially sort of what kinds of questions are the right questions to be asking. So this is a codex, manuscript codex that's at the Vatican from the same period. Michael Reeve dates it to the second half of the 15th century. And I refer to this copy as the erotic copy of Perseus for reasons that you'll see soon. So in this erotic copy of Perseus at the Vatican, you'll see as you open it that there's this little sort of retroactive table of contents on the left-hand side. Stephanie Frampton pointed out to me that this is later than the rest of the book. And it supposedly contains Perseus's satires, the Priapeia of Virgil, which is something I'll come back to, Catullus, the love poet, Catullus, and the elegist Tibullus. So generally speaking, poems with an erotic bent. I was pleased to see Perseus included here with these other poets because I've always interpreted some of his satires, especially Satire 5, as a straightforwardly erotic song, even though the preponderance of scholarship sees it as a boring, tough, and stoic song. I'll share that passage with you shortly. But first, I just want to linger here with the sort of opening of his book. Those of you who are looking closely can see that the first page of this is none of the things that I just mentioned. And sort of actually a joke. The joke here on the first page, at least, is that this erotic codex starts with the first 40 some odd lines of Lucretius, which, like Perseus's satires, is supposedly a philosophical text meant for our edification. But here we have only the hymn to Venus, which is the beginning of Lucretius's Epicurean didactic poem. But this copy stops exactly before Lucretius shifts from singing to the goddess of desire, and stops exactly before he says, but actually philosophy will cure us of our confusion. And so the maker of this book is sort of tendentiously ripping this hymn to Venus out of Lucretius and saying, actually, this would be better included in this sort of erotic collection, which I think is great. So then why include Perseus, the supposedly moralizing satirist, in such an erotic collection? Perseus is usually thought of as virginal, the virginalis poeta, basically asexual, as like a young boy, even though he was an adult male, as he's thought of as a stoic moralizer. But this binding, this inclusion of Perseus with other erotic poets only makes sense if you just take a different view of what's actually going on in Satires 4 and 5, I think. So on the one hand, there's the obscene passages of Perseus, one of which I showed you earlier in the sort of anal sex interpretation of a recitatio. Here in Satire 4, we have a very different version of Socrates from the sort of Socrates that's always invoked as being, you know, the first wise guy, speaking to his infamous pupil Alcibiades, yelling at him, really, saying, "The kids these days, both dick and dark deep private parts, get weeded out to bare vaginas shriveling for the public's view. What's more, if you perfume and comb the shag upon your jaws, then why is that close-cropped tonsured windpipe sticking out your crotch?" Basically, the idea here is that Socrates is on a rant against depilatory practices, but this is actually a very Roman version of Socrates. And then we have in Satire 5, so that could be one thing that the bookmaker is thinking of, just the sort of obscene, the Perseus' propensity to the obscene and sexual. And on the other hand, if we're thinking more about sort of genuine erotic desire and love, perhaps the bookmaker is thinking of Satire 5, the so-called encomium to Cornutus, which has been called a dedication from one tough Stoic to another, which I see somewhat differently. Not me. I'm not at work to so engorge my page with funereal nonsense just to render hot air serious. We speak in private, and we, I suppose, is Cornutus here, the Stoic philosopher. Now the goddess song commands we give our inner heart to you for spanking, since so great a part of our own soul is yours, Cornutus. Yes, my sweetest friend, to show it off to you's a pleasure. Pound it, judge with care the solid sounds, and what's the echo of a painted tongue. It's here that even I'd demand 100 throats from me, to lay out with my naked voice how much I've fastened you within the folds of my own heart. And let my words unseal the whole that's not describable, concealed inside my guts. And then a little later, I subjected me to you. You took my tender years in your Socratic lap, Cornutus. So one of the things that I was visiting the Vatican and looking at this, this version, the sort of erotic version of Perseus, at the same time that I was undertaking this translation project, actually. And so I found that it sort of liberated me in some ways to actually just go for the erotic translation of these lines rather than try to mitigate it in some way. So thank you to the bookmaker. But there is also some forthcoming scholarship by not me also sort of interpreting these lines in the same way, that actually this is just a genuinely erotic poem. And so the erotic copy continues as promised with some pre-epic songs, whose content you can guess by the penis scribble in the lower left-hand side. So it ends with the Carmina Priapeia, which at the time of the making of this book are still traveling with the name Virgil, something that notably does not happen anymore. The Virgil in the modern discipline of classics has been cleaned up and straightened out. Historically, these pre-epic poems did travel with Virgil, however. And so we're also reading Virgil in a sort of time that's historically anomalous. For most of Virgil's history, he has traveled with pre-epic poems, and we are reading Virgil as non-pre-epic. So I realized quickly upon seeing this codex and others like it, that I would need many more comparanda and to choose them well. So I abandoned this for the first project, but it is something that I am looking towards and looking for feedback on for the second. The consequences of the encounter stayed with me, and I did rewrite the first Perseus book constantly with the consideration of ancient format and practices of reading in mind, which I wouldn't have been as attuned to had I not worked with these historical copies, because my way of reading previously had just been sort of assumed that these features of the text were sort of natural features of the text, that Perseus is small, that Perseus belongs with Juvenal or with Horace, etc. So the payoff is real. It's just not exactly what I thought it was going to be. And so now I'm actually turning to that other project with new eyes. And here's where I'm hoping to be able to think along with you all about sort of the history of circulation of texts and new directions to go in. It turns out that many very smart people have thought about these problems before. In Grafton and Jardine's Demystifying History of How Humanism Became the Humanities, this pairing of Persius and Ovid is not at all what I thought it was. It's not a rebellion against the strictures of being bound forever to Juvenal and finding solace in an iambic book. Instead, it turns out that this codex reflects late 15th century development in humanism, which prized the explication of especially riddling poetry as an opportunity for intellectual bravura, so to speak. Presumably the cutting down of the ibis in this copy and the provision of really identical space in the margins around the text was intended for the insertion of an analogous explication of Ovid's long riddling curse poem, analogous to the treatment of Perseus. And it also reflects the renewed significance in this period of Perseus' satires and Ovid's ibis, coming after Vala, actually. Perseus and less often read works of Ovid became important precisely because of the interpretive and syntactical problems that they represent. And for some teachers, the obscurity of works like these was a feature and not a bug of the text. It was an opportunity to sort of show great skill. But if this pairing made me think about genre differently, these books can also help us think about authorship, I think. And so if genre is contingent on binding, it might turn out that authorship is as well. The excision of the Priapeia, along with the other poems of what's now called the Appendix Virgiliana, a modern name given to the poems traveling under Virgil's name that aren't the eclogues, Georgics, and Aeneid. This name was given to this collection about 100 years after these books appeared by Scaliger. But if genre is sort of determined by binding, perhaps authorship is too, and how we think of the author. And so I'm going to end with a couple of examples of how I've been starting to think about Virgil and binding together. So I think the prefaces to the Aldines are very good sort of proxies for the type of thinking that's happening here. The Aldine editions, which we don't have I don't think we have the Virgil Aldine, but we have other Aldines here, so you guys will be able to see the size that is referenced in these prefaces. So in these small, the small Aldines, the smallness of the Aldine becomes important for Aldus Manutius in how he talks about and tries to sell his books. So in his first printing of Virgil in 1501, he, on the one hand, lets the buyer know that they are finally seeing an unblemished text of Virgil, and that they're getting the eclogues, Georgics, and Aeneid. But we did not think that all the other poems that he composed to practice his skills and the obscene poems that are ascribed to him were worthy of this pocketbook-sized format, as Grant translates Enchiridion. Enchiridion, classically meaning manual, it fits in your hand. But it turns out that this Enchiridion format was associated with the personal prayer book. And so presumably what Aldus is thinking is that the reader might be offended, or he was offended by the idea of including the preopic poems that had been traveling with Virgil in this prayer-like format. And that this was not how he wanted the young men of the Republic of Letters to understand their Virgil, what would be a modern Virgil. You can see on the next that just 4 years later, he caves to the market. So, we've undertaken them to print them a second time in our small format so that they can conveniently accompany you wherever you go. We have also added his short works, both those that he composed in his youth and those that are included with them. We did not think that the obscene poems were worthy of our pocket-sized volume of this Enchiridion, this prayer book format. But since many persons have demanded them with constant clamor, we did order them to be added to the volume on the condition that they could be detached separately if anyone so wished. Presumably that's on like a separate choir or something that can be pulled out, although I forgot to look for that. You will readily see in what a corrupt and depraved state these short works have been circulating widely when you compare such copies with ours. So I think what's really interesting here is that Aldous shifts the depravity of the content of the poems to the depravity of the quality of the texts as they're transmitted, and so just sort of shifts what is bad and makes it into a type of badness that can be corrected. Now, he doesn't win at this point. Obviously, he caves to the market, and the formal cleavage of the pre-epic poems doesn't happen for another 70 years. But you can see the kinds of considerations that are going into binding Virgil differently, having to do with format on the one hand, having to do with propriety. And it is true, it is absolutely the case that we now have, and there's a lot of really interesting new work on the Appendix Virgiliana. It is absolutely true that we now have very good scholarly reasons for not considering the poems of the appendix to be authentically Virgilian. But the initial cleavage was about character, and it wasn't Aldous, it was an earlier humanist, Pomponia Leto, who first proposed this. And so I do wonder how committed we would be, or how far down this path we would have gone in terms of disavowing Virgilian authorship, if not for that binding practice, which was made for different reasons. So finally, I will just, oops, there we go. And you can see what Aldous is sort of up against here. This is an incunable, so an early printed book of Virgil that is quite scholarly in intention, right? So it's prefaced, as you can see in the far left-hand image, you can see, I hope it's a weird angle, I couldn't get a full shot. A scholarly, Servius's commentary on the eclogues surrounding the text of the eclogues, very similar to the handwritten copy of Perseus. But then you can see at the end of this volume in the third image that the Priapeia, the Carmina Priapeia are included as Virgilian here. So finally, the sort of direction that I'm going into and hoping to use Perseus and the pre-epic poems as sort of case studies for our sort of the historical contingency of our relationship to our scholarly books, and the ways in which our understanding of ancient text is predicated upon modern and historically anomalous formats. But the sort of number of directions I've gone into and been surprised actually by what I found have been many. And so I'm really actually pleased at the very beginning of this project to be able to ask for sort of feedback and pointers on what sort of questions I'm not asking, because of my training is in quite a different field. And yeah, what kinds of questions I should be asking and considerations I should be thinking about. And thanks very much for listening and for your time.
Thank you. That was fascinating. If you stop sharing, we can see everyone on Zoom too. Okay, the floor is open for questions.
It's fascinating. Thank you. So the
the manuscript here that has the Ovid with the Perseus, is the, I guess I wanna make sure I understand that commentary was added after the middle parts of the pages were written out, is that correct? So it's a different person who wrote the glosses around the. Yes.
That's right. Although you can see in contemporary sort of graphics, I should have shown this, but there is a sort of imagination in this period that you have the poetry and the commentary produced at the same time. So there is an early book image of Perseus dictating his poetry in the center, flanked by two humanist commenters who are writing down notes. And yes, absolutely. So the text would have been formatted with the idea that the commentary would fill out the page, but one of the sort of imaginations in the period seems to be that these are sort of co-productions, even though obviously historically they're not.
So the commentary does, I mean, I have two follow-up questions. One is that is there any kind of implication that the commentary is key to what's on that page?
Yes.
Okay, because it looks like it's just continuous and it doesn't look like, there are breaks for, I mean, just from the pages that you showed. And then the second question is there similar commentary on the Ovid? Because it didn't look like, at least on the front page.
Yeah, so both Perseus and Ovid's Ibis are two of the texts that have long traditions of commentary associated with them. Sort of traditions of commentary in the sense that marginal comments are not whatever the person reading happens to think, but actually they travel, and so they're become traditional interpretations form, and often they're alternative interpretations. So you'll get, this could be X, Y, or Z different understandings. So I think what's probably happening on the paper Ibis is that it was formatted to accommodate the same type of commentary, and then they just didn't get around to it. And there are other features of the book that they didn't get around to, such as filling in the first letters as well. There's also space around that, so we might think that it's one of a few features of the text that doesn't get. So if I can just show you here, oops, how do I have to go back to share? Sorry. So if you look here, you can see that the first letter is also missing. And oops. Oh, well, we can look also together at the actual copy, but there are other features of the text that are missing. So it's not completed, but it's ready for the commentary to be filled out.
So the commentary was already settled on. Which commentary would go around that, and then it just got.
Yeah, so with the, I'm trying to, without giving people too much visual distraction, let me just go back to that original page. So there is a set of scholia, traditional scholia called the Commentum Cornuti, which are believed to have a lot of ancient material in them, and that is traveling as its own text. Has its own textual tradition. When I first approached this, I had expected this actually just to be a copy out of the traditional scholia, but it's not. I think, and I haven't done like a line by line comparison yet, but it seems to be a mixture of traditional interpretations alongside modern insertions, hence the reference to Vala, etc.
So the modern insertions are like the interlinear within the middle.
No, the commentary all around is also is a modern commentary, and so there are two or three modern commentaries that are circulating in this period that you can see in other copies, other early copies. Some of the incunables of Perseus have actually all three of them associated, and so you'll get multiple preambles and forms of notes. I think it's Barroaldo, Badius, and one other modern commenter, but understood to be sort of great teachers, great humanist teachers. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, but looking at that page and the one page you've shown of the Ovid, it looks like the text block of the Perseus is much smaller. The margins leave much more room for commentary than the Ovid. You did mention that the paper for the Ovid has been cut.
It's been cut down.
So
yeah.
So there seems to be a lack of intention to surround, by whoever copied the Ovid, a lack of intention to surround it with the same kind of commentary that you have around the Perseus, or is that not the case? I mean, I just don't know how you would write so much commentary on that page if one were so inclined.
Only on the bottom.
Yeah, perhaps only on the bottom, perhaps not an exactly equivalent amount.
But on the bottom is not the standard format. The
Yeah.
total surround is the standard format for commentary on Virgil or the Bible or
I think it's that different. You can see the show through on the left-hand side. I don't think it, I think there's an optical illusion a little bit
But also,
because of the blankness. Like, it doesn't look that different. I mean, you could just measure, but it doesn't look that different to me.
but wouldn't one usually do the commentary beforehand? I mean, so that it would have been done before you cut it.
for the
down?
central text,
Yeah.
oh, before cutting.
But clearly it was interrupt. I mean,
Yeah.
the project wasn't brought to completion, obviously. Yeah, Marco, you wanted to-
I have a couple of questions. One is, when did the miscellany come together as one book? Like you have the watermarks that probably give you
Yeah.
a-
So the watermarks are similar. The watermark on the paper copy is similar to watermarks in the area of Venice and Treviso in the 1480s, 1490s. So pretty close. And like with watermarks, you can't say that it was during that decade, obviously. But that's sort of, it's at least in that period.
And the other two questions that I have are related to how extravagant is this combination, this miscellany, compared to the general transmission of the satires by Perseus? Because it's not like we pair Perseus and Juvenal to make the book thicker. It's already a pairing that exists in classical antiquity and literary criticism. Quintilian puts them all together, like Lucilius and then
Yeah.
Horace and then Persian and Juvenal. It's like it's a genre that is conceived of
Yeah.
as such already in antiquity. So I'm wondering, how much does this combination reflect the personal taste of a very smart reader, and like I'm totally persuaded by your reading of the satires, but how much of a detour from the textual transmission tradition of Perseus is this?
Yeah, it's an enormous detour. And that's why I was very like provoked by it, actually. Yeah, so Quintilian puts Perseus along with the hexameter writers of satire. There are good reasons to think about genre along those lines. I think, and also in the many medieval manuscripts that we have, and also the most ancient manuscripts we have, which I think are late antique, also traveling with Juvenal, which is why I found this like a very, very surprising combination, which turns out to reflect a contemporary taste actually for the sort of puzzling as a virtue rather than as a vice, which starts to become the dominant narrative in the centuries following. Yeah.
But Peter, you want to ask your question?
Sorry, are you?
Yes, you.
Oh, sorry. Kate, thanks so much. That was really wonderful. Could you show the image again of the penis as a kind of manicule? It looks like it's, you know.
I've been calling it, I don't know what the formal name is. I've been calling it a mentulula, a very small.
It's a Latin name for sure.
And it seems to have a.
No, so what struck me was on the other side of the page. If I'm reading it right, it says priapus ad furem. Is that right?
Yeah, to the thief.
You can
To the
use
thief. And that is that? So I take it that's Priapea, the Priapea 56, which is actually about a thief who is mocking Priapus for having a wooden penis. It gives him the middle finger. And then
Yeah.
he says, so having given him the middle finger, he says, your penis is only made out of wood. So I'm just wondering if there's any, it looks to me like it could be the same hand, the same kind of ink anyway, and whether there's some connection between the penis on the left-hand side, on the one hand, very priapic, I mean, obviously erect, but also this joke is that Priapus's actual penis is, according to the thief, is just wooden.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of, thank you for that. I think there are a lot of ways to, I mean, the sort of Carmina Priapea, the Priapic songs are really sort of songs about the problem of erection in some ways. And so, yeah, I don't know if the little reddish brown mentula is meant to just alert readers to what's coming, but yeah, it certainly reflects the content. And I have found these on other pages as well of some of these poems. And it's just a lot of fun to see. And to be honest, like, yeah, it also makes one wonder too about the readers. I used to, like many graduate students, tutor middle school boys Latin. And one would have to have a very placid countenance when tutoring, because you would open up their textbooks and find all sorts of decorations next to their morphology tables. But yeah, so not always reflecting content, but sometimes reflecting content. In this case, yeah, I think so.
But it seems to strengthen your case a lot, this is a reader responding absolutely to the erotic, aspect of this. And, it just seems to me it's not, you've got something further to go on there.
Yeah. So taking sort of marginal scribbles as part of the reader response is, yeah. Thank you so much.
I mean, am I the only one who sees the initials ED?
No,
Which it's definitely like a modern. That's not an early modern term. So
Where do you see that?
yeah, it's like ED underneath.
what
I had.
Oh, that's really funny.
Zach is proposing an.
it looks like a monogram. I
That's
mean,
funny.
it might be the reader's initials,
That's really funny. I did not see that. Thank you, Zach.
but something. I mean, it looks like the letters ED in an early modern. And can I ask? So it's very striking to me. I mean, first of all, I really enjoyed this a lot. I love the whole story of like how this project is developing. I liked how you kind of framed that. It's very striking to me how some of the issues. There's a book that is published in Material Text series on printed collections called Bound to Read by Jeffrey Todd Knight. It's in my period, and it does have some classical text in it, but sort of by happenstance.
Okay.
But it's really about earlier practices of binding and how they were undone and then redone in modern ways by most rare book libraries. And it kind of raises a lot of the same questions for me. I mean, not always self-consciously, but my reading of it brought to mind some questions that I feel like are pertinent here, which is like, it always feels like it really matters whether these combinations, like to what extent we ascribe different kinds of intention to the combinations, and like is it being done
Yeah.
as part of the production of the book, or is it being done post facto by a purchaser of different books who is binding them together perhaps for a different reason? Is it content based? Is it size and format based? So all those questions arise in your reading of the manuscript, though there's like added interesting stuff when it's manuscript and not print. Like the mixture of parchment and paper, I think, is fascinating.
Yes.
But the fundamental question is like, what matters? Why does it matter? Like what's, let's say that book is put together from two different books that a reader purchased in two bookshops, two manuscript, books. You could buy manuscripts in bookshops, over time, and then they were roughly similar sizes, so I bound them together, or, what are they in the same hand? If the Ovid and the Perseus in the same hand, like that changes our sense of what it means. Though I feel like we haven't come to any kind of agreement of why and like what changes about that. So that's one question that this raises for me. And they're both forms of reception, but one is a kind of reception that results in production, and one is a kind of reception that, one is being produced by a bookseller or a bookmaker, and one is being produced by a book buyer.
Yeah.
They both tell us different things about the readings of these texts, but not exactly the same thing. So I just wonder if I'm curious whether those are the same questions that kind of have been swirling around in your mind. They've kind of been there's been a lot of discussion of this question in early modern English book history, because it is a common thing to do, to bind up different books, printed books, for exactly the reason that you're saying Penguin is doing it. Right? They're just not big enough to bind up by themselves.
Yeah.
And then, some people say, look at these things go together, and then other people say, it's just they're both duodecimo, so they don't go together, as if that dissolves all meaning, but it's not clear to me that it does.
Yeah. I think also for me, the question is like, who then counts as the book maker, and like which point is the sort of meaning made?
Or are different kinds of meanings made if it's different kinds of bookmaker for us?
Yeah. I think once you get past the Roman book roll, which again, Perseus' Satires is like the perfect length for that. It's like 700 lines. It's lovely for a little Roman book. Once you're not in that format anymore, he becomes like combinable. But yeah, no, I would love to look at that literature on so this is on the English side, you're saying?
Yeah. And it's all printed. So I mean, another question is like I just don't know, I haven't looked at enough manuscript books, like how common is that hybridity of parchment and paper? And does the just mere fact of them being bound together tell us something about the origins of the book or not?
I think with the case of the parchment here, is that the parchment for this codex is used in spite of the fact that paper is already being used and is in good quantity and good supply. The parchment versus paper, I think, is a little bit of a red herring in the sense that it makes us think that, oh, this must be much older than the paper Ovid, but it's not. It's with the dating of the parchment side, whoever made it could have easily used paper in this region and just chose to use parchment, and then cut down the paper from a larger size. So what was the answer in Bound to Read? I'll read it. It's okay.
Very up in the air. I mean, I think that he provides some answers, but it's still very much an open question.
I was going to say, I can think of other cases with vellum and paper together that we have that were put together, like our Apicius and our Platina.
Yes.
There are definitely other examples, but I was wondering, can I just follow up with the question about the Morgan copy and what's in the Morgan copy?
Exactly, yeah.
Sorry, maybe I didn't explain that enough. Do you mean the Morgan copy of Perseus?
Side by side.
Oh yeah. So this is the Morgan copy. I do have photos of this, but I won't get into it. The Morgan copy is the Editio Princeps around 1469 or 1470 by a German printer in Rome, Ulrich Hahn. This copy binds together Juvenal and Perseus.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
the thing that I'm struggling with is, depending on which sort of path I'm taking in the scholarly literature, I'm seeing different answers to the question of sort of priority and popularity in this period. In the coming of the book, without a sort of footnote, the claim is that Perseus is actually more popular than Juvenal and Horace by 1515. And there's an early 20th century bibliography of the incunables of Perseus by a guy named Morris Morgan, but not related to the Morgan Library, who says that it's a myth that that these were intended to travel together, that they were actually printed separately and they just came to be bound together really regularly. But he's seen copies where they aren't, where Perseus is separate. But and then there's it just sort of depends on what sample size people are looking at, basically, I think. And so I'm still trying to figure out sort of what the right sample size is in terms of figuring out what is actually the state of play. Oh, I see.
I mean, I'd love to sorry.
Oh,
Go ahead, Gary.
oh, my question is this one, regarding the Virgil II Aldine. I thought it was interesting that when it came to the way it dealt with the stuff that was the supposedly obscene stuff, the stuff like that, it gave it the courtesy of caring about textual accuracy. That is, if I would understand that correctly, then you made the point that in a sense, the distortion is taken from. I don't need an answer from Wikipedia, sorry. It goes to the point of saying that is, you'll see in what a corrupted and depraved state these short works have been. That's a big gesture. When you print the stuff that's the secondary stuff, the stuff like the obscene, but you give it the dignity of, we've come up with a good edition. I'm speaking as someone who knows a lot of 18th and 19th century texts where they come up with a text from an earlier period, and there's certain things that are questionable, and they get a deuterocanonical status by not being edited, where you don't look at variants, where you don't care whether your text is better, instead of like, here's the stuff. So there's a way in which this stuff is disowned by being at the end detachable. The line from Byron's Don Juan about how the trouble of an index and that edition of Marshall from what is the 14 to 1500s, where all the nasty epigrams are at the end, you know, kind of hide it, put in the appendix. What I think is interesting is how much dignity that's giving to the stuff that it's calling obscene and sort of secondary and such.
Yeah.
It's saying we got a good text of it. We got the stuff that is, I mean, isn't that, am I misunderstanding?
No, I think that's right. And this is really common to the language of the Aldine prefaces. So what he really wants to put forward in the prefaces in general, there are sort of two governing themes for these prefaces. One is that his editions are small, and while in the case of Virgil, that happens, it's about sort of the worthiness of the small format. For most of the other prefaces, the smallness has to do with familiarity. You will know it like you know your hands. But the other major theme is the cura, the amount of care that he has taken to provide sort of an uncorrupt, an unblemished text, which is also a part of the sales pitch for the text. But yes, very much a sort of rhetoric of the disgusting body of the text from before, which has now been cleaned up and cured and doctored into the sort of healthy body of the Aldine version. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
So many ironies there, because smallness, secrecy, erotic book, there's a long tradition of, you know, the small format and the need for discretion.
Which I think really comes out in the copies of like Catullus, and you sort of have it means one thing in the case of Virgil, which he kind of abandons after the Virgil, and the smallness means something very different when you get to the elegiac poets. Yeah.
What's great there, though, is the idea that you can detach them
That is
That
fascinating.
was, I think.
That-
really
That has to be that it's
interesting.
printed on a separate.
We need to,
separate
Yeah.
we
file.
need to really look at some topics.
Yeah.
You wanted
Yeah.
to do so, so.
Well, and that's an interesting clue
Yeah.
there in terms
Yeah.
of the kind of circulation
Well, I
of.
mean, it would be
You can
interesting
take
to
your book
look,
apart as
Yeah.
well as put your book together.
Mhm.
to look at whether
Anybody.
the majority of copies have it or whether
Mhm.
Yeah.
people have actually,
Mhm.
removed it.
The only copy that I got to look at so far at the Morgan is, I think, from 1534. So after he's no longer actually supervising, and I stupidly, because I was doing a lot of different things that day, didn't look to actually check that. But when I go back, I will. But it would be even better to see it in an actual 1505 copy rather
Right.
than 1530s or 1540s
I
copy.
think you should do them all. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's really
have to
interesting,
find them
the
all.
idea that he's printing with the idea that
yeah, it's a
something doesn't have
perfect,
to
it's
be.
perfect for this binding
Yeah.
story. It's the
Binding
coming
story.
together and the coming apart.
Right.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It
Yeah,
also shows that, I mean, it's often said that binding, and even some bibliographers will exclude binding, it's kind of
Yeah,
a separate
yeah,
area
Yeah.
of scholarship because it's sort of not part of the book. But it is implied, this shows that actually in the actual printed sheets, there is an implication about binding. Like,
Yeah.
so it does matter if you're printing a collection of texts, whether, where are things detachable? I mean, you can split the Shakespeare First Folio into the three genres because bibliographically that works. What you can't take out a single play from each of those because bibliographically it doesn't work. And other books are printed so that you can.
Yeah.
So there is, binding is already implied in the printing, but it is also somewhat separate. So again, it's like, where do we put the weight with binding in relation to the text?
Yeah.
And this, just getting back to Marco's question, I think is also interesting. The other sort of philosophically, like how much does it matter if this is one example of someone doing the erotic,
Right.
Right.
or 10 examples?
Yeah.
Clearly the mainstream is like satire,
Yeah.
right? But you're kind of showing like marginal or subaltern neglected Perseus versions, in which case does it make a big difference if it's 1 or 10 or like how many do you need to make it count?
Yeah.
It sounds like the Perseus and Ovid, you might expect to find more of these if that is a kind of school text, right?
I
Yeah.
do think the numbers, not that it's quantifiable scholarship here, but I agree. It's sort of are there others seems an important.
yeah, that's what I was gonna
It
ask, how many
becomes
other.
almost
countries do
archaeological.
it?
Yeah.
I mean, we get this all the time. What do you do with the artifact
Right.
for which
So
you
one.
can't find a parallel,
Yeah.
or at least you haven't found one yet? And as a heuristic, it actually gets very interesting. What is it about this world that this art? What is the world in which this artifact is possible?
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, whatever else it is, we're talking about a culture in which this could happen.
Mm.
Where you can turn idiosyncratic not into a hovel, but into a kind of like
Right, exactly.
a window or a porthole. I mean, if it is one of very few, you're sort of seeing a person, Kate, who's actually responded
Mhm.
to this culture of binding and unbinding,
Right.
taking it, metaphorically into their hands. That this culture is breeding someone who can think this way.
Yeah.
Whether or not lots of people think that way, you can say to a reader when you write that out, I'm gonna give you my thoughts, and I'm not gonna wait 30 years till I've just like turned gray in the Vatican Library. I wanna give this to you now.
Yeah.
Are there things like this? But it's simply the thing in and of itself, and we get this as a hot box all the time. What
Mhm.
to do with the orphan
Mm.
things? It's a big problem for me. Again, what do I do?
Yeah.
And I was sort of taught by Peter Brown, this is what you do with the text for which we've lost the parallel.
Mhm.
And he would always use the metaphor from Tolkien at the time in Berkeley. He would do in a Gollum voice, what has it got in its pockets? That's the baggage of someone's mind.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that analogy.
Traveling with, I think if you take that sort of metaphor, what do you choose to keep company with?
Mhm.
Because there are really three travelers. There's you know, the same railroad car, there's Perseus, there's Ovid or Juvenal, and there's you.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, you become, if you like, the sort of fellow traveler. Are you the person who's gonna keep turning the pages or not?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Do you see, and I think you can kind of take some of your own metaphorical language in a sense and kind of push it
Mm.
further, use it as a kind of teasing apart. At least that's how it's hitting me, and I
Thank
don't know if
you.
that's sort of useful.
No, it's really helpful to think. I didn't think of thinking about this as an analogy to other forms of like material evidence from material culture. Yeah, it's really helpful.
I think Mark got another question.
Yeah.
I'm still like thinking through my
I-
questions. I'll probably ask you
Peter
later.
wanted to, you wanted to respond, Peter, again? Peter Stalybras?
That was one of the things that was so fascinating to me about the question of length and the length of a scroll. And I'm thinking, you know, on the one hand, you've got this problem within religious history because the Torah scroll is totally atypical. I can't think of any classical scroll that begins to be as big as the Torah scroll, which puts 5 books of the Bible together. But
Mhm.
to me, the most interesting thing, and the most interesting thing in relationship to what you're thinking about in the analogy, is that the long books of the Bible are totally arbitrarily split up, and people always thought they weren't. So they misinterpreted Kings, like Kings and Samuel are divided up. And people have always tried to, once you get them as books, you then try
Yeah.
to interpret what the distinction is. But it's absolutely clear now. It's purely about length. It's that it wouldn't fit on a scroll. So
Right.
you divide it between 2 scrolls, and vice versa. The so-called minor prophets, and I don't know when they became called that. I mean, they're anything but minor.
Right.
They're some of the major prophets from a Christian point of view, but they were so short that the 12 minor prophets fit onto a single scroll. So I think one of the interesting things that would be really interesting to pursue is that whole question of when you start needing to bind things together. Zach, for instance, done a lot of work on the distinction between pamphlets and books. So that's a much later, but you get, it seems to me you have some kind of interesting comparisons, even within classical literature, about very short books, you know, but meaning things that literally can fit into much less than a scroll.
Yeah.
And then what do you do? But you can always, with a scroll, you can make it any length you want to, you know, you can keep adding. And that's the thing you can't do with a book. You know, once you've bound a book, it creates real problems, you know. So you need to, on the one hand, make it fat enough to be worth binding, which is why, you know, Zach basically, I think, am I taking words out of your mouth, but you basically argue that virtually never is a play bound up by itself. You know, you virtually never, because it's too short. So it could be
Yeah.
a pamphlet. So I just wondered if you got any examples of people talking about that in classical antiquity, about what it means to make a very short scroll, which you can perfectly easily do.
Mm.
You really can't very easily make a very short book, a bound book.
Yeah. So Perseus refers to his book as a libellus. He
Right.
talks to it and says, "Oh, my little book, libella." And so he is thinking of it as a short-ish book. But if you compare it to books, say books of an epic, it's just about the same length as some books of epic, not all. So Lucretius's books are longer, but 700 lines is not something that you would say this isn't this couldn't possibly fill out its own volumen. It's a nice length for a little book. I think it sounds like something similar happens from what you're saying about the Torah. Something happens with ancient epic much earlier, actually, for the books of Homer, and also probably the books of Naevius, although we're not quite sure, but for the very earliest Roman epics, sort of retroactively divided into proper book lengths that are then taken to be intentional in some way. But then because these book lengths are then, once you format something, it becomes a feature of the genre. And so then interpreters do look for meaning in the beginning and end in epic, as you're saying in Torah. And so it is really interesting to think about these sort of features of format that become meaningful, or maybe we're always meaningful. Thank you so much.
There's the other thing that's striking is, so it's very rich because you're kind of looking at this history, like you said, there's questions about authors finding works by the same person together. Peter and Roger have written on, what happens if you bind someone only with themselves, versus you bind someone with others, like Juvenal and Perseus, and Perseus might be too short to bind only with himself, which is a problem for an author, right? For becoming an author. So you've got author, you've also got the affordances of scroll and codex. And since you're dealing with classical literature, it's like, what happens when you're transitioning into a codex dominant moment? And you've got manuscript and print. Right? So you've got like these multiple, if you're dealing with the late 1400s, you're like in this liminal period for all these forms. And you're talking about the much later reception of classical literature, or re-reception of classical literature. So there's something really like productive about that, and it's almost like how you're gonna keep those balls in the air strikes me as the really difficult question for this project, because I think some of the things are about what happens when you think of literature as basically looking like a codex. And even though they knew obviously about scrolls, but you forget about it. Right? Yeah. And some of it is like, what happens when you're thinking of this literature as printed, like Aldine, right? Like that whole prefatory Aldine language is very, very much like his development of print language, right? And like instead of written. And then what happens when you're thinking of it as Perseus, in a kind of modern author-centric way, versus other conglomerations of text, whether it's metrical or generic, or
One thing you might think of in the transition, though, from scroll to codex is, the way you at least keep what you're reading or keep things together is you have a box. There are many pictures of that box. That box even gets carved for portrait statues, the capsa. And the fascinating thing is you can fill out a book fat enough to be bound of just Juvenal and just Perseus, that in the box would be rattling around. Right? To just have a couple of little scrolls in a box, there's a lot of space. Do you know what I mean? In your tendency.
You mean in the
capsa?
Yeah, in the capsa.
In the capsa. I mean, think about it. You've got
Wants companions.
Just got a couple little things that are lying on their side, almost on their side. You see what I mean? What does it mean to like fill out a box? The box.
That's interesting.
Homer would sort of nicely pack a box. But these little things, one of your tendencies would be to just carry it or keep it, is that you might have several little scrolls in a capsa. I've often wondered about that.
Unless like Marshall's, there's actually Sam and I read this poem together, a poem of Marshall, in which maybe we didn't actually. I did read it with some students last year. Where a woman keeps her libelli, her little books, under her pillow. So, the sort of the intimate book doesn't go in the capsa. The intimate book goes in the bed or something. And of course, there are all sorts of erotic undertones with that as well, because of the necessary shape of the volumen. But yeah, I really like that idea that you could also think of this as collectible in some way, or part of a larger sort of architecture.
Assembled almost willfully things. Some of the transition from like scroll to codex is in many ways also how you keep them and how you assemble them. So we get the idea in the early life of codices, like in the 5th century or whatever, the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia, you have open bookshelves and they'll get the titles of what you're seeing. So you get a bookshelf, armoire bookshelf. This doors open and has exactly the four gospels. You know, you sort of packed up this thing.
Mm.
What do you,
Yeah.
what do you keep together in containers? Because if you think of a binding as a kind of a box or a container,
Mm.
that can be very generative to think about it.
Yeah, so capsa is sort of analogous to binding,
Yeah,
although it's
binding
more
is-
fungible.
Much-
Yeah, yeah.
And pages with, you know, and they treat, at least in the Middle Ages, which are the only bindings I really know much about, on a surface level, it's treated as a very beautiful box.
Well-
Treated like a beautiful container, and it has hasps.
Yeah.
Which I can't say hasps 10 times very fast. You know, a
Yeah.
thing, it's very much a containing.
And to that end, I know we're gonna stop soon, but I would encourage you, I think you ought to look more at the binding. And that Morgan binding, we ought to study those things. I think it'd be a fun thought experiment to think of those as belonging to the same person, what the heck? Who wanted a printed edition and their manuscript nearby, why not? And I don't know, that it's a long shot, but there, you know, it's a stunner image that you have.
Yeah,
Obviously, there are a lot of early modern bindings that look alike.
Yeah.
And one couldn't read too much, but you know, as
it was alarming. I took the measurements of them. They're they're
Well,
almost the same.
more about the decoration, there are
Yeah.
lots of clues that one could look at and start to really think about how these boxes, to
Yeah.
use your metaphor, may or may not really belong together as a group. Might be a
Yeah.
few more of them out there.
Collections.
Yeah, you get these very early codices, Kate, which are fun. They're often reproduced because they're images of authors, but
Yeah.
what is it?
Peter
The-
Scott
I always forget it's the
Dropbox.
Vatican Virgil or that, you know, sort of sitting there, he's inside a codex and he's got his capsa scrolls
Mhm.
next to him.
I'll have to look for that.
Which is really fun. I'll get you remind me and I'll send you the JPEGs for that.
I will. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, just write me and say, Anne, capsa pages.
Well, I think we should give you a rest now. That was a really exciting.
Thank you guys all so much for weighing in. I really, 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 really appreciate it. Really appreciate
And now is the chance to look at that MS Codex 6,
The actual.
which is
much
the
smaller.
star of the show here. So this is.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. It's really helpful to get to hear what questions people have.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really, really helpful.
It's like you can get questions from every direction.